A decorated black veteran, Colonel Marcus Richardson, steps into an airport, his uniform adorned with medals that speak of decades of service and sacrifice. He's not seeking attention, just another traveler navigating the chaos of modern air travel. But what should have been a routine flight turns into a harrowing ordeal when a flight attendant, driven by unconscious bias, questions his credentials and escalates the situation by calling airport police. What unfolds next is a confrontation that exposes more than one person's prejudice. It lays bare the deeper flaws in a system that allows such injustices to happen. With passengers recording the incident and whispers of outrage spreading through the terminal, the fallout is swift. The flight attendant faces the repercussions of her actions, while the veteran's calm integrity sparks a chain reaction that challenges the status quo. This story isn't just about one man or one moment, it's about the courage to stand tall in the face of injustice and the power of accountability to inspire change. Stay with me, because what happened next will leave you speechless. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story moves you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of resilience and redemption. What started as a misunderstanding turned into a moment that would change lives forever. Let's begin. The morning sun cast a honeyed glow over the modest Virginia suburb, its light slipping through the blinds of Colonel Marcus Richardson's study. Inside, the air was thick with quiet purpose. Marcus stood before the full-length mirror, the room around him lined with bookshelves and a lifetime of mementos. His reflection stared back, steadfast yet weathered, his uniform crisp and adorned with medals that bore witness to decades of sacrifice. The silver star on his chest gleamed faintly, its polished surface belying the battles that had carved it into existence. Marcus's hands moved with a practiced precision, adjusting his crimson tie, smoothing the fabric of his jacket. Yet his mind wandered. 30 years in service to a country that had, at times, seemed unwilling to serve him in return. The memories came unbidden, the sharp commands on distant battlefields, the silent stares in rooms where his skin spoke louder than his rank. The weight of every moment he chose to stay silent when speaking up might have cost him more than his career. Hold still, Dad. Amy's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone tinged with exasperation and affection. She stepped into the room, her youthful determination a counterpoint to his measured resolve. At 19, Amy carried her own fire, a spark inherited from her father but shaped by a different world. Her slender fingers deftly straightened a slightly askew metal, her face a mixture of pride and reproach. "You always say you've got it, but you never do," she teased, her voice light but her words grounded in truth. Marcus chuckled softly, the deep timbre of his laugh filling the quiet room. "And here I thought I was still the colonel in this house." Amy smirked, stepping back to take in the full sight of him. "Today is different, Dad. You're meeting an airline CEO. You need to look perfect." Marcus's smile faded slightly, his reflection staring back at him like a silent judge. "It's not about perfection, Amy," he said, his voice softening. "It's about doing what's right." But his words felt heavier than he intended, the morning's anticipation beginning to press down on him. Today wasn't just about protocols or procedures, it was about creating a space for others like him. A chance to ensure that respect was more than just a courtesy extended in theory. It was a mission no less important than those he had undertaken in uniform. Amy's voice broke the silence again, this time softer. "You could have retired, started relaxing. Why keep pushing yourself like this?" He turned to face her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Because I owe it to you and to everyone your age. The battles don't end when the uniform comes off. They just change." Her expression softened, and she leaned in to hug him. "You're the best dad anyone could ask for." But before he could respond, the trill of his phone interrupted the moment. Marcus glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number. His baritone was steady as he answered. "Colonel Richardson speaking." The voice on the other end was brisk, tinged with formality. "Colonel Richardson, this is David Langston. I hope you're prepared for today. The board is eager to hear your ideas." "I'm ready," Marcus replied. "We're focusing on passenger experience, correct? Among other things," Langston said, a faint hesitation in his tone. "Just be prepared. Today's flight might hold a few surprises." Marcus frowned as the call ended. Something about Langston's words lingered, an unspoken tension beneath the surface. Setting the phone down, he glanced at Amy. now gathering his briefcase and travel documents with a practiced efficiency. Ready to take on the world, Colonel? She asked with a playful glint in her eyes. He smiled faintly, but the weight in his chest refused to lift. Always. As Marcus stepped into the crisp morning air, the quiet unease grew louder in his mind. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that felt almost deceiving in its serenity. He moved with the steady gait of a man who had weathered storms far greater than most could imagine. But as he approached the car waiting to take him to the airport, he couldn't shake the sense that today's challenge wouldn't be as straightforward as a battle fought on foreign soil. The airport buzzed with the familiar chaos of travel-harried passengers juggling luggage and frustration. Announcements crackling over loudspeakers. Marcus navigated the crowds with practiced ease, his uniform drawing the occasional glance of curiosity and admiration. But not all eyes were kind. He could feel it, those fleeting, judgmental looks that lingered just long enough to remind him of the quiet prejudice woven into the fabric of daily life. At the check-in counter, the agent greeted him warmly, her demeanor professional but genuinely respectful. "Colonel Richardson, thank you for your service," she said as she processed his ticket. Marcus nodded, offering a polite smile. "Thank you." But the moment he stepped away from the counter, the undercurrent of unease returned. It was subtle at first, a flight attendant's gaze lingering a fraction too long as he approached the gate. Her polished uniform and practiced smile couldn't quite hide the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Rebecca Conway, her name tag read. She greeted him with a tone that was polite but cool. Her words clipped as she scanned his ticket. "First class, Colonel Richardson?" she asked, her voice carrying a faint note of incredulity. "Yes," Marcus replied evenly, his calm demeanor betraying none of the frustration building beneath the surface. Rebecca hesitated, her gaze flicking to his medals as if searching for something in inconsistency. A reason to validate the doubt gnawing at her. The moment stretched uncomfortably long, and Marcus felt the first stirrings of anger rise in his chest. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. Rebecca straightened, her practiced smile faltering. "No, sir, just routine." But her eyes betrayed her, and Marcus knew better. This wasn't routine. This was something deeper, something that spoke of the biases she might not even realize she carried. As she stepped away to verify his credentials, Marcus glanced around, noticing the passengers beginning to whisper, their eyes flicking between him and the gate agent. The tension crackled like a live wire. This was not the battlefield he was used to, but it was no less a fight. And as Marcus stood there, his military composure unbroken, he knew one thing for certain: this moment was just the beginning. Rebecca Conway's alarm pierced the silence of her cramped apartment in Queens, jolting her out of a restless sleep. She groaned, slamming her hand against the clock with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the small room, joining the faint hum of traffic outside. Morning light filtered through thin curtains, painting the peeling wallpaper in uneven patches of yellow. It was a modest place, a stark reminder of how far she still had to climb. Rebecca shuffled into the tiny bathroom, staring at her reflection with tired eyes. She pulled her dark blonde hair into a tight bun, her fingers moving mechanically. At 26, she was used to the relentless grind of her job as a flight attendant. The long hours, the smiling mask she wore for passengers, the constant juggling of ambition and survival, it all weighed on her. But today, something heavier sat in her chest. The upcoming supervisor interview loomed large in her mind, a possible escape from the financial quicksand she felt herself sinking into. Just a few more rungs, she muttered to herself as she buttoned her uniform. The crisp fabric hugged her frame like armor, but it didn't shield her from the gnawing anxiety beneath. Her debts, student loans, car payments, and helping her mother with rent were like invisible shackles. Every decision she made felt like a calculation, a choice between survival and sacrifice. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from her coworker Sophia Chen flashing on the screen. "Morning, Becky. Don't let the stress get to you. Remember, tight security doesn't mean forgetting compassion." Rebecca rolled her eyes and tapped out a curt reply. "Compassion doesn't pay bills, Sophia." She tossed the phone into her bag and grabbed her coat. Outside, the sharp winter air bit at her cheeks as she stepped onto the crowded street. Her breath puffed in visible clouds, mingling with the exhaust from passing cars. The world moved around her in a blur of urgency, a reflection of her own internal rhythm. She tightened her scarf and quickened her pace toward the subway, the weight of her ambitions driving her forward. The airport terminal was a symphony of controlled chaos. Announcements echoed overhead, suitcases rolled along tiled floors, and travelers moved with the nervous energy of people desperate not to miss their connections. Rebecca arrived at the crew lounge, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She spotted Sophia sitting at a table, her calm demeanor a frustrating contrast to Rebecca's simmering tension. "Becky," Sophia greeted with a warm smile. "Rough morning?" "They're all rough," Rebecca replied curtly, brushing past her to pour a cup of coffee. The sharp bitterness matched her mood. Sophia followed, undeterred. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. Maybe take a breath? You know, a little kindness goes a long way." Rebecca turned, her tone clipped. "Do you know what happens if I don't push myself? I stay stuck. I can't afford to be kind." "Sophia, not with the bills. Not with my mom counting on me." Sophia studied her quietly, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "Just be careful, Becky. How you treat people matters." But Rebecca was already moving, her focus shifting to the gate assignments for the day. She scanned the list, her eyes landing on the first-class flight to Denver. It was supposed to be routine, another step in the endless dance of maintaining order amidst the chaos. Yet as she walked toward the gate, she couldn't shake Sophia's words, their quiet truth scratching at the edges of her thoughts. By mid-morning, the tension had already begun to mount. A delayed flight had sent passengers swarming the gate, their frustration boiling over into sharp words and impatient demands. Rebecca handled them with practiced efficiency, her voice calm but detached. Beneath the surface, though, her irritation simmered. Every complaint felt like a personal affront, every pointed question a challenge to her authority. Her chance to regroup came during a brief break. She leaned against the wall in the crew lounge, sipping water and trying to calm her frayed nerves. But even here, she couldn't escape the mounting pressure. A senior flight attendant passed by, giving her a pointed look. "Smile a little more, Rebecca," he said with a half-joking tone. "Passengers can feel the tension. You know." Rebecca forced a tight-lipped smile, but her grip on the water bottle tightened. She hated the implication that her stress was a weakness, something to be smoothed over for the comfort of others. When she returned to the gate, the boarding process for the Denver flight was underway. The line of passengers moved steadily, punctuated by the occasional hiccup of forgotten boarding pass, an overstuffed carry-on. Then Marcus Richardson stepped forward. Rebecca's practiced smile faltered for just a moment. He was tall and composed, his military uniform immaculate and his demeanor calm. His presence exuded authority, the kind that didn't ask for permission. Rebecca's gaze flicked to his ticket first class and then to the silver star glinting on his chest. Something about him set off a quiet alarm in her mind, a whisper of doubt that she couldn't quite place. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice polite but cautious. "Traveling alone today?" "Yes," Marcus replied evenly, handing her his ticket. Rebecca scanned it, her brow furrowing slightly. Everything was in order, yet the doubt remained. Why would someone like him be traveling alone in first class? It didn't fit. The thought was fleeting but insidious, like a splinter lodged in her mind. "Just a moment, sir," she said, stepping away. Marcus's calm voice followed her. "Is there a problem?" "No, not at all," Rebecca replied quickly, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. "Just routine." Her colleagues watched from the sidelines, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. Sophia stepped closer, her voice low. "Becky, everything seems fine. Let him board." Rebecca waved her off, her focus still on the ticket. "I've got this," she said sharply, more to herself than to Sophia. The tension at the gate was palpable now, a quiet storm brewing as passengers began to notice the delay. Rebecca could feel their eyes on her, their whispers growing louder. She glanced at Marcus again, his calm gaze unwavering, and felt a flicker of anger rise within her. Why was he so composed? Why did he seem so untouchable? It wasn't about the ticket anymore. It was about the silent challenge in his presence, the way he held himself as if no one could question his right to be there. Rebecca made a snap decision. She gestured to the nearest security officer, her voice firm. "I need assistance verifying this passenger's credentials." The moment the words left her mouth, She felt a shift in the air, the tension snapping like a taut wire. Marcus's expression didn't change, but the sharpness in his eyes cut through her like a blade. "Miss Conway," he said, his voice steady but edged with quiet authority. "I suggest you proceed carefully. There are consequences for making baseless accusations." For a split second, Rebecca hesitated. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on her, but she doubled down, the pressure of her ambition and the gnawing need to assert control driving her forward. "I'm just following protocol," she said, her voice rising slightly. But even as she spoke, she knew the words rang hollow. And in the faces of the passengers watching, she saw the beginning of a storm she might not be able to contain. The hum of the airport seemed to fade into the background as the tension at Gate 27 reached a fever pitch. Rebecca Conway stood rigid, her professional mask slipping as she waved over the security officer. Marcus Richardson, tall and unyielding in his military uniform, remained composed, though the air around him seemed to crackle with the quiet intensity of his presence. His calm wasn't just defiance, it was something deeper, a lifetime of navigating moments like this, where his dignity had to be held tighter than his anger. The security officer, Derek Morrison, approached quickly, his steps brisk but unhurried, as if the gravity of the situation had already reached him before he arrived. His sharp eyes darted between Rebecca, standing defensively, and Marcus, whose posture spoke of authority that required no affirmation. "What seems to be the issue here?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone trained to diffuse conflict. Rebecca thrust Marcus's military ID toward him. "I need assistance verifying this," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "The credentials seem unusual." Morrison took the ID, his brows furrowing as he examined it. The name and photo matched the ticket perfectly, and the insignia on the ID left little room for doubt. But as his eyes lifted to Marcus, something clicked. "Colonel Richardson," Morrison said, his tone shifting to one of quiet respect. "Sir, I served under your command in Afghanistan. It's an honor to see you again." Rebecca froze. The ripple of recognition that spread across Morrison's face was unmistakable. And for the first time, the ground beneath her seemed to shift. The words she had been so sure of moments ago now felt fragile, their weight crumbling under the gaze of the man she had been so quick to question. Marcus gave Morrison a small nod. "Good to see you again, officer," he said evenly, though I would have preferred it under different circumstances. The crowd around them, once murmuring in hushed tones, now began to stir with more pointed whispers. Phones were held higher, capturing every angle of the confrontation. A few passengers spoke aloud, their voices cutting through the thick tension. "He's a war hero. What's she even questioning? This is disgusting. Why would they treat him like this?" Rebecca's hands trembled as she tried to maintain her composure. "I was just following protocol," she said, her voice defensive, though it wavered under the growing weight of the moment. Morrison turned to her, his expression hardening. "Protocol doesn't excuse disrespect," he said, his voice sharp enough to silence her. "You should have recognized his rank immediately. That's not just a uniform, it's decades of service." Sophia Chen stepped forward then, her face pale but her voice steady. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "this has gone far enough. Let him board." Rebecca turned to Sophia, her face flushed with frustration and something dangerously close to shame. "I'm doing my job," she snapped, though the conviction in her words had begun to fracture. She could feel the crowd's judgment like a physical force pressing down on her. And the realization that she was losing control sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Marcus, still standing in place, finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Conway," he said, addressing her directly for the first time, "you've made your point. Now, I suggest you let me board before this becomes something far larger than you intended." The warning in his tone was subtle, but it carried the weight of experience of a man who had seen far more battles than the one unfolding before him now. But Rebecca hesitated, her pride warring with the sinking realization that she had made a mistake. The moment stretched unbearably, the silence filled only with the clicks of cameras and the murmurs of passengers. And then, the tipping point came. David Langston, the airline's CEO, arrived at the gate, flanked by two senior managers. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes swept over the scene with the sharp efficiency of a man accustomed to crises. He approached Marcus first, Extending his hand. "Colonel Richardson," Langston said, his voice measured. "I'm David Langston. On behalf of the airline, I'd like to apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus accepted the handshake but said nothing, his gaze steady and unflinching. Langston turned to Rebecca, his tone cooling. "Miss Conway, please step aside. We'll discuss this matter further in a debriefing." Rebecca opened her mouth to protest but found herself at a loss for words. The weight of Langston's authority was undeniable, and the looks from her colleagues and the crowd made it clear that she had lost any semblance of control. She stepped back, her heart pounding as Marcus finally boarded the plane, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos she had left in his wake. As the passengers settled in, the whispers and side glances continued. Rebecca, standing near the gate, could feel the sting of their judgment like tiny daggers. Sophia approached her cautiously, her voice low but firm. "Becky," she said, "you need to think about what just happened. This isn't about protocol. This is about something deeper." Rebecca turned to her, the defensiveness in her voice returning like a reflex. "What are you trying to say?" Sophia's eyes softened, but her words cut straight to the point. "I'm saying you need to ask yourself why you made it about him. Why you felt the need to question someone who's given everything for this country." The words hit like a blow. And for the first time, Rebecca couldn't muster a reply. She watched as Sophia walked away, her colleagues' words ringing in her ears. Inside the plane, Marcus settled into his first-class seat, the weight of the confrontation still pressing on him. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. But the whispers of passengers nearby were impossible to ignore. He handled that so well. She should lose her job for this. Marcus opened his eyes, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to be a spectacle, a symbol, or a rallying cry, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who had faced injustice in countless forms, that this moment wouldn't be contained. It was already spreading, and by the time the plane landed, the world would know what had happened. And Rebecca Conway, sitting alone at the gate, would have to reckon with the storm she had unwittingly unleashed. The gentle hum of the plane's engines offered little comfort to Marcus Richardson. As he gazed out the small window, the world below seemed impossibly distant, a patchwork of cities and fields stitched together in quiet harmony. Yet, the storm brewing above the clouds was anything but serene. The events at the gate had set something in motion, a chain reaction that Marcus could feel rippling outward even as the plane climbed higher into the sky. He adjusted his tie, his movements slow and deliberate. It wasn't the first time he'd faced such indignities, but this time it felt different. The weight of the passengers' stares, the accusatory glint in Rebecca Conway's eyes, and the murmurs of the crowd, it all lingered like a heavy shadow over his thoughts. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a reminder of the world waiting for him to land. He ignored it for now, closing his eyes to center himself. He had learned long ago how to wield patience as a weapon. But even patience had its limits. Back at the airport, the air was electric. Rebecca Conway sat stiffly in the break room, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee cup. The confrontation replayed in her mind like a relentless loop. Every glance, every word, every subtle shift in Marcus's expression haunted her. But it wasn't just his calm defiance that unsettled her, it was the way the crowd had turned. The judgment in their eyes had cut deeper than she expected. Sophia Chen entered the room, her footsteps light but purposeful. She leaned against the table, her arms crossed, and studied Rebecca with a mix of concern and disappointment. "Becky," she said softly, breaking the heavy silence, "what are you going to do about this?" Rebecca's head snapped up, her voice defensive. "I was just doing my job." "Were you?" Sophia asked, her tone calm but cutting. "Or were you letting something else guide you? Something you don't want to admit?" Rebecca's breath caught, and for a moment, the room felt suffocating. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, though the words sounded hollow even to her. Sophia sighed, her voice softening. "You need to think about why you felt the need to question him so much." "Why him, Becky? Why not someone else?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Rebecca looked away, unable to meet Sophia's gaze. Deep down, she knew the answer, but to say it aloud felt like stepping onto unsteady ground. By the time Marcus's plane touched down, the story had already taken flight. The video of the incident at the gate had spread across social media, accompanied by hashtags like #RespectOurVeterans and #AccountabilityMatters. Clips of Marcus standing calmly as Rebecca grilled him were juxtaposed with headlines questioning the broader implications of racial bias in everyday life. As Marcus stepped into the arrivals terminal, his phone buzzed incessantly. Messages poured in, some from friends and fellow veterans, others from strangers who had seen the video and wanted to offer their support. He ignored most of them, his focus on the car waiting to take him to his meeting with the airline's CEO, David Langston. The drive to the corporate office was quiet, save for the occasional buzz of Marcus's phone. He glanced at it briefly, catching snippets of the public response. This man gave everything for his country, and this is how he's treated. It's not just about one flight attendant. It's about a system that allows this to happen. How many more Marcus Richardsons have to endure this before something changes? He set the phone down with a sigh. He had no desire to become a symbol, but the world seemed intent on making him one. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, the storm raged on. David Langston stood in a glass-walled conference room, flanked by senior executives and public relations officers. The tension was palpable as they watched the video play on a loop. Their faces a mixture of frustration and concern. This isn't just bad PR, one executive said, pacing the room. It's a spotlight on everything we've failed to address. Bias training, customer service protocols, it's all under scrutiny now. Langston held up a hand, silencing the chatter. We don't have time to point fingers. What we need is a plan, and fast. Colonel Richardson will be here any minute, and we need to show him that we're taking this seriously. A PR officer cleared her throat. The public wants accountability. Suspending Conway won't be enough. We need a systemic response. Langston nodded, his jaw tight. Then let's make it systemic. Start drafting a framework for new training programs. And get Conway into a meeting with our. I want her to understand the gravity of this situation. Back at her apartment, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the flood of notifications on her phone. The comments stung like needles, each one a reminder of how far the story had spread. She shouldn't just lose her job, she should lose her career. Another example of unchecked bias ruining lives. She needs to face consequences. But the system needs to change too. Her mother's voice interrupted her spiral of thoughts. Rebecca, we need to talk. Rebecca looked up, her face pale. Mom, I don't, her mother said, her tone firm but not unkind. I watched the video. Do you understand what you did? Rebecca's chest tightened, the shame she had been holding at bay threatening to overwhelm her. I didn't mean for it to happen like that, she said weakly. Her mother sighed, sitting across from her. That's not good enough. Rebecca, that man has spent his life serving this country. And you treated him like a criminal. Rebecca blinked back tears, the truth of her mother's words cutting deep. I didn't think. No, her mother interrupted. You didn't. And now, you have to face the consequences. At the corporate office, Marcus sat across from Langston, his calm demeanor betraying none of the turmoil beneath the surface. Langston leaned forward, his tone measured but urgent. Colonel Richardson, he began, I want to start by apologizing. What happened at the gate was unacceptable. And we take full responsibility. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze steady, acknowledging the problem is a start. He said, but what matters is what you do next. Langston hesitated, then said, we're committed to implementing new training programs. Ones that address implicit bias and improve customer interactions. And we'd like your input, your guidance. Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. I'll help, he said finally, but only if this isn't just about saving face. If you're serious about change, then I'll give you everything I've got. Langston extended his hand. You have my word. As Marcus shook his hand, he felt the weight of the moment settle on him. This was no longer just about what had happened at the gate. It was about something far larger, a fight for dignity, respect, and the possibility of a world where no one else would have to endure what he had. And for Rebecca Conway, still sitting in her apartment, that fight was only beginning. The boardroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Marcus Richardson sat at the far end of the long table, his hands resting on the polished wood, his expression unreadable. Across from him sat Rebecca Conway, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tension between them was thick, an invisible thread stretched taut by the weight of unspoken truths. David Langston, the airline's CEO, broke the silence. His tone was measured, but the gravity of the situation underlined every word. We're here to address what happened at Gate 27. He began, glancing between Marcus and Rebecca. This isn't just about one incident. It's about what it represents. For all of us. Rebecca shifted in her seat. Her gaze fixed on the table. She could feel Marcus's presence like a shadow looming over her. His silence was more powerful than words. A steady reminder of everything she had failed to see. Langston turned to Marcus. Colonel Richardson, I want to thank you for being here today. Your patience and grace throughout this ordeal have been remarkable. Marcus nodded, his voice calm but firm when he replied. Patience, Mr. Langston, is not infinite. Grace is not a gift freely given, it is earned. What happened at Gate 27 is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of deeper, systemic issues, and those issues require more than apologies. Langston's jaw tightened, but he nodded. We agree. That's why we're implementing a new cultural awareness program. And we'd like your help in shaping it. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. If I agree to this, it will not be a box you check to quiet public outrage. It will be a commitment to change, to accountability, to progress. Is your company prepared for that? Langston hesitated, then said, yes, we are. The meeting shifted focus to Rebecca. Langston gestured toward her, his tone cooling. Miss Conway, you've been suspended pending the outcome of this investigation. However, this meeting is also an opportunity for you to address Colonel Richardson directly. Rebecca looked up, her throat tightening as she met Marcus's gaze for the first time. The weight of his eyes felt like a judgment she couldn't escape. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. I want to apologize. She began. What I did at the gate, it was wrong. I see that now. Marcus remained silent, his expression unchanged. Rebecca faltered, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy stone. I wasn't trying to, she continued, her voice faltering again. I didn't mean to disrespect you. Marcus finally spoke, his tone quiet but unyielding. Intentions are irrelevant when the impact causes harm. Miss Conway, your actions were not just about me. They were about what I represent. And whether you admit it or not, you made a decision based on an assumption, a dangerous one. Rebecca flinched, the truth of his words cutting deep. She had spent days justifying her actions to herself, clinging to the belief that she had been following protocol. But now, faced with Marcus's unwavering calm, she couldn't hide from the reality. I didn't realize, she began. But Marcus interrupted her. That's the problem, he said. You didn't realize. And people who don't realize perpetuate the same cycles over and over again. As the meeting concluded, Langston escorted Marcus out, leaving Rebecca alone in the boardroom. The silence felt oppressive, each second stretching endlessly. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her actions settling fully on her chest. Marcus returned to his hotel room that evening, the day's events replaying in his mind. He stood by the window, looking out at the city lights below. The weight of what he had agreed to do helping shape the airline's cultural awareness program was heavy. But he carried it with the same resolve he had carried into battlefields. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Amy. Saw the news. Dad, proud of you, but I hope you're okay. He smiled faintly, typing a quick response. I'm fine, one step at a time. But as he set the phone down, he felt the exhaustion creeping in. The fight for respect, for justice, was never ending. And while today had been a victory, it was far from the last battle. Rebecca, too, was facing her own reckoning. She sat at her kitchen table, a stack of HR documents and mandatory training materials in front of her. The words blurred together as she stared at them, her mind racing. Her mother sat across from her, her expression firm but concerned. Rebecca, her mother said softly, you need to confront this, not just for the airline, but for yourself. Rebecca looked up, her eyes tired. I know, she said, but where do I even start? Her mother reached out, placing a hand over hers. Start by listening, by understanding. You don't have to fix everything overnight, but you do have to try. The first session of the Cultural Awareness Program was scheduled for the following week, and both Marcus and Rebecca would be in attendance. The tension between them was far from resolved, but it was a collision of truths that, while painful, held the promise of transformation. And as Marcus prepared to step into the next chapter of this fight, he knew that change wouldn't come easily, but it would come. The training room was stark and sterile, its fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and a whiteboard at the front of the room bore the words, Cultural Awareness Workshop, Understanding Bias. Building Bridges. Rebecca Conway sat in the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the tension in her shoulders visible to anyone who cared to look. The room slowly filled with other airline employees, flight attendants, gate agents, even a few members of the security team. Conversations were hushed, and every now and then, someone would glance at Rebecca, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She avoided their eyes, staring instead at the workbook on her lap. The title mocked her, Understanding Implicit Bias in the Workplace. At the front of the room, Dr. Elaine Parker, a poised woman with a warm but commanding presence, waited patiently for the room to settle. Her calm demeanor belied the gravity of what was about to unfold. Good morning, everyone, Dr. Parker began, her voice steady and inviting. Today's session isn't about shame or blame. It's about understanding, about looking inward and asking the hard questions. Because the truth is, we all carry biases, whether we want to admit it or not. Rebecca felt a twinge of discomfort at the word bias. It sat heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. She shifted in her seat, her pulse quickening as Dr. Parker continued. We're going to start with an exercise, Dr. Parker said. She handed out blank index cards to everyone in the room. On this card, I want you to write down a time when you judged someone unfairly. You don't have to share it out loud, but I want you to reflect on it. What assumptions did you make? What did it cost you and them? Rebecca stared at the card in her hand, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to write something vague, something safe, but as the seconds ticked by, the memory of Marcus Richardson at Gate 27 pushed its way to the surface. His calm eyes, his steady voice, the weight of his words, they all came rushing back with a force that made her chest tighten. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in a small conference room down the hall, meeting with David Langston and a group of senior airline executives. The room buzzed with a quiet urgency as Marcus outlined his vision for the Cultural Awareness Program. This can't just be a one-time fix, Marcus said, his voice firm but measured. Training sessions are a start, but real change comes from accountability. It has to be woven into the fabric of your organization. Langston nodded, taking notes. We're committed to this, Colonel. Whatever resources you need, we'll provide. Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. Resources are one thing, commitment is another. Change doesn't happen without discomfort. Are you ready for that? Langston hesitated, but before he could answer, Marcus's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. Amy's name flashed across it. He let it go to voicemail, his focus returning to the room. Let's hope your team is, Marcus said, his tone soft but unyielding. Back in the training room, the tension was building. Dr. Parker had moved on to a discussion about implicit bias, encouraging participants to share their thoughts. A few brave voices spoke up, their words hesitant but sincere. I guess I've made assumptions about people based on how they look. One gate agent admitted, it's not something I'm proud of, but it happens. Rebecca felt the room's collective gaze shift slightly in her direction. Though no one said her name, her stomach churned, the weight of her own unspoken admission pressing down on her like a stone. Dr. Parker smiled gently. Acknowledging bias is the first step, but it's not enough to simply recognize it. We have to actively work against it. That's where the real change happens. By the time the lunch break arrived, Rebecca felt like she could barely breathe. She slipped out of the training room and found a quiet corner of the hallway, leaning against the wall as she tried to steady herself. Rebecca. She looked up to see Sophia Chen approaching, her expression cautious but not unkind. Sophia held out a bottle of water, which Rebecca accepted with a quiet, thanks. You okay? Sophia asked, her voice soft. Rebecca hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know, she admitted. I feel like everyone's staring at me, judging me. Sophia leaned against the wall beside her. Maybe they are, but maybe that's part of the process. You can't fix what you don't face. Rebecca stared at the water bottle in her hands, her mind replaying Dr. Parker's words. Do you think I can fix it? After everything? Sophia paused, then said, I think it's not about fixing. It's about doing better. You can't change what happened, but you can change what happens next. The afternoon session was more intense. Dr. Parker played a video of a similar incident involving a passenger of color being unfairly targeted at an airport. The room was silent as the footage unfolded. The tension in the video mirrored by the discomfort in the room. When the video ended, Dr. Parker turned to the group. "What do you see here?" she asked. "What went wrong?" A few people spoke, their answers cautious and clinical. But Rebecca felt something rising in her, an urgency she couldn't ignore. She raised her hand. "It's not just what went wrong," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's why it went wrong. That's the real question, isn't it? Why do we assume things about people who don't look like us? Why do we let fear and bias dictate our actions?" The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Rebecca felt exposed, vulnerable, but for the first time, she didn't shy away from it. She let the words hang in the air, heavy but honest. Dr. Parker nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's a powerful question, Rebecca, and it's one we all need to ask ourselves." As the day ended, Rebecca lingered in the training room, her thoughts a whirlwind. She glanced at the workbook on the table, its pages filled with notes and reflections. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of something unfamiliar: hope. Not that she could undo the past, but that she could start to rebuild something better. Marcus, too, was reflecting on the day. As he walked through the quiet corridors of the airline headquarters, he thought about the faces in the room, the difficult conversations, the resistance and the progress. It was a beginning, he knew, but beginnings were fragile things. They required care, persistence, and the courage to keep going even when it felt impossible. And for both Marcus and Rebecca, the journey was far from over. The fight for understanding, respect, and justice would continue. But for now, there was movement, and in that movement, there was hope. The conference room buzzed with a quiet intensity as Marcus Richardson stood at the front, a marker in hand, outlining his proposal on a whiteboard. The words were sharp and deliberate, much like the man himself: empathy, accountability, action. Behind him, a projection displayed slides filled with data on systemic bias in customer interactions, instances of racial profiling, and the disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. The weight of the statistics pressed on everyone present, a sobering reminder of the work that lay ahead. Seated at the long table were airline executives, HR representatives, and members of the newly formed Cultural Awareness Team, including Rebecca Conway. Rebecca sat toward the back, her notebook open but untouched, her pen hovering over the page as if unsure where to begin. Her presence in this room felt both necessary and unbearable, a constant reminder of the gate incident that had ignited this firestorm. Marcus turned to face the group, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "This isn't about optics," he said, his deep baritone cutting through the room like a blade. "If you think this is just a PR move, you're wasting your time and mine. Real change requires discomfort. It requires looking at the places we've failed individually and collectively and deciding that failure is no longer acceptable." The room was silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. David Langston, the airline CEO, leaned forward, his expression serious. "Colonel Richardson, we understand the stakes, but how do we move from awareness to action? What does that look like?" Marcus set the marker down and folded his arms. "It starts with acknowledging the power dynamics at play," he said. "When someone walks into an airport, they're entering a system that decides, often unconsciously, who belongs and who doesn't. That decision can be the difference between dignity and humiliation, respect and disregard." He turned his gaze to Rebecca, who stiffened under the weight of his attention. "Miss Conway knows this better than most," he continued. "She made a decision based on an assumption, a decision that could have escalated into something far worse if not for the presence of witnesses and technology. But this isn't just about her. It's about the culture that allowed her to make that decision without questioning it." Rebecca's cheeks burned, but she didn't look away. The room's focus shifted to her, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. But then, something in Marcus's expression softened, not forgiveness, exactly, but an invitation. "What do you think, Miss Conway?" he asked. His tone measured. "What needs to change?" The question hung in the air, and Rebecca felt the weight of every eye in the room. Her throat tightened, and for a brief moment, she considered deflecting, retreating into the same defenses she had used at the gate. But as the silence stretched, she realized that this was her moment to face the truth. She straightened in her chair, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. I think we need to start by admitting that we don't know what we don't know. I made assumptions that day. I thought I was following protocol. But I was really just acting on my own biases. And that's not an easy thing to admit. The room remained quiet, but Rebecca pressed on, her voice growing steadier. But it's not just about me. It's about the training we've had or haven't had. It's about the culture of fear and pressure that makes people prioritize rules over humanity. And it's about what happens when those things collide with prejudice. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. And what are you prepared to do about it? Rebecca's heart pounded, but she met his gaze. I'm prepared to do the work, she said, whatever it takes. As the meeting continued, the tension began to shift. The initial discomfort gave way to a sense of urgency. A shared understanding that the stakes were too high to ignore. Marcus outlined a series of actionable steps: mandatory bias training, accountability measures for staff at all levels, and partnerships with organizations that specialize in diversity and inclusion. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum, he said. You need outside perspectives, people who can challenge your blind spots and hold you accountable. Langston nodded, his pen flying across his notepad. We'll start reaching out to consultants immediately. Rebecca's hand finally moved across her notebook, jotting down notes and ideas. For the first time, she felt like she was contributing to something meaningful, not as an apology, but as a commitment. Outside the conference room, Marcus and Rebecca found themselves alone for the first time since the incident. The hallway was quiet, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. Marcus slowed, turning to face her. You spoke well in there, he said, his tone even. Rebecca blinked, caught off guard. Thank you, she said. I meant it. Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. Words are a start. Actions will tell the rest of the story. Rebecca hesitated, then asked, do you really believe people can change? Marcus's expression softened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. I believe they can try. And sometimes, trying is enough. That evening, Marcus returned to his hotel room, his mind replaying the day's events. The progress they had made felt tangible, but fragile. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with setbacks. Change always was. His phone buzzed with a message from Amy. Proud of you, Dad. It's not just about the past, it's about what you're building for the future. Marcus smiled faintly, her words a reminder of why he was doing this. It wasn't just for himself. It was for Amy, for her generation, and for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Across town, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, poring over her notes from the meeting. Her mother entered the room, setting a cup of tea in front of her. How was it? Her mother asked gently. Rebecca looked up, her expression thoughtful. Hard, she admitted, but necessary. Her mother nodded, her eyes filled with quiet pride. That's how change feels. Hard, but worth it. Rebecca stared at the notes in front of her, the words blurring slightly as a single thought took shape in her mind. This is just the beginning. In the quiet spaces between their separate lives, Marcus and Rebecca were united by a shared purpose: to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for too long. And as they prepared to take the next steps, they both knew that the real work, the hard work, was only just beginning. The evening sun cast long shadows over the city as Marcus Richardson sat in the back seat of a car on his way to a community forum. The hum of the engine blended with the rhythm of his thoughts. Steady yet charged, his mind replayed the events of the past weeks: the confrontation at Gate 27. The meetings, the training sessions, each moment felt like a drop in a vast ocean, rippling outward in ways he could not fully predict. He stared out the window, watching the world blur past, a mosaic of lives intersecting in fleeting moments. Some faces flashed briefly: a man leaning against a lamppost, a woman hurrying across the street with her child, an elderly couple walking hand in hand. Each life carried its own weight, its own battles, and yet, beneath the surface, they all shared something: a society shaped by layers of bias, unseen but deeply felt. The car pulled up to the forum venue, a modest community center buzzing with activity. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. People filled the rows of folding chairs: veterans, activists, airline employees, and members of the public who had seen Marcus's story unfold online. The room hummed with quiet conversations, but the tension was unmistakable. Marcus stepped into the room, his presence commanding without effort. Conversations hushed as heads turned toward him. He could feel their eyes on him, some filled with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with skepticism. He had faced this gaze before. In different forms. In different places. It was the look that demanded not just words, but proof. Rebecca Conway arrived shortly after. Slipping through the side entrance. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she scanned the room. She wasn't sure what compelled her to come. Perhaps it was a sense of duty. Or maybe guilt. Whatever it was, it pulled her here, to a room filled with people she didn't know but whose lives, she realized, were intertwined with her actions. She spotted Marcus near the front, speaking with a small group. His calm, steady presence seemed to anchor the room. And for a moment, Rebecca felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name: admiration, perhaps, or regret. She took a seat in the back row, hoping to observe without drawing attention. The forum began with a short introduction from the moderator, a local activist who spoke passionately about the need for conversations like this one. Then Marcus was invited to the stage. As he approached the podium, the room fell silent. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice resonant but restrained. "I stand before you not as a man without flaws, but as someone who has learned that growth often comes from the hardest moments of our lives." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. What happened at Gate 27 was not new. It was not unique. It was a moment in a long history of moments where assumptions and biases dictated actions, and where respect was withheld based on nothing more than perception. Rebecca felt her chest tighten at his words. She lowered her gaze, gripping the edge of her chair. Marcus continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "But I don't share this to condemn. I share it to illuminate. Because change starts with acknowledgement. It starts with saying, yes, this happened. Yes, it hurt. And yes, it can be different." The audience erupted in applause. A wave of emotion that swept through the room. Marcus stepped back slightly, letting the energy settle before speaking again. "This isn't about blame," he said. "It's about responsibility. Responsibility to see the humanity in each other. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." As Marcus concluded his speech, the moderator opened the floor for questions. A young man in the front row stood, his voice trembling as he addressed Marcus. "Colonel Richardson, how do you stay so calm? I mean, after everything, how do you not get angry?" Marcus smiled faintly, his expression thoughtful. "Anger is natural," he said, "and I won't lie, I've felt it. But I've learned that anger, unchecked, can burn everything in its path, including the things worth saving. So I channel it. I use it as fuel for something greater." Rebecca listened, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Her thoughts spiraled as other audience members asked questions, each one peeling back another layer of the complex dynamics at play. Finally, the moderator called for one last question, and Rebecca felt her hand rise before she could stop herself. The room turned to look at her, and her throat tightened as she stood, feeling exposed under their gaze. I just wanted to say something," she began, her voice shaking. "To Colonel Richardson." Marcus turned toward her, his expression unreadable but attentive. "I was the flight attendant at Gate 27, she said, her voice cracking slightly. A murmur rippled through the room. "And I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I acted on assumptions I didn't even realize I had. And I hurt someone who deserved far better." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of them. But then she forced herself to continue. "I've been trying to make amends. But I know that's not enough. What happened that day, it wasn't just about me. It was about something bigger. And I want to be part of the solution. I want to learn. I want to do better." The room was silent, the tension almost unbearable. Then Marcus spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Conway," he said, "acknowledging what you've done is a start. But as I've said before, words are only the beginning. It's your actions that will tell the rest of the story." Rebecca nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I understand," she said softly. As the forum ended and people began to leave, Marcus and Rebecca found themselves standing face to face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus extended his hand. "Thank you for speaking," he said. "It takes courage to stand in front of a room like that." Rebecca shook his hand, her grip firm despite her trembling. "I'm trying," she said. "I just hope it's enough." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Trying is where it starts. Keep at it." That night, as Rebecca sat alone in her apartment, she replayed the events of the forum in her mind. For the first time, She felt a glimmer of hope, not that she could undo the past, but that she could build something better from it. And miles away, Marcus stood by his window, looking out at the city lights. The road ahead was long, but tonight, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of change. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Marcus Richardson's study, casting long shadows across the desk where he sat. A stack of documents rested beside him, proposals for the airline's cultural awareness program, notes from community leaders, and an ever-growing list of contacts who wanted to collaborate on this effort. Each piece of paper carried its own weight, a reminder that the work ahead was as vast and intricate as the problem itself. The quiet was broken by the buzz of his phone. Marcus glanced at the screen. It was Amy. He picked up, her voice bright but tinged with concern. "Hey, Dad, I saw the news clip about the forum last night. You were amazing." Marcus smiled faintly. "Thanks, sweetheart." But Amy hesitated, and Marcus heard the tension in her voice. "I read some of the comments online. People are saying awful things about you. About the program. They're calling it performative, saying it won't change anything." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. He had seen the comments too. Words like virtue signaling and waste of resources stung. But they weren't unexpected. Change always comes with resistance. He said quietly, "The louder the pushback, the closer you are to hitting a nerve." Amy sighed. "I just don't want you to carry all of this alone." Marcus smiled, her concern warming him. "I'm not alone, Amy, but thank you." Meanwhile, across the city, Rebecca Conway sat in her small apartment, staring at her laptop screen. She had spent the better part of the morning drafting an email to Dr. Parker, the instructor from the training sessions. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the words "I want to help" glaring back at her. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, the rush of action momentarily silencing the ever-present voice in her head that whispered it's too late. The next meeting at the airline headquarters was tense. Marcus entered the boardroom to find a group of executives waiting, their faces strained. David Langston greeted him with a firm handshake, but the unease in his eyes was clear. "Colonel Richardson," Langston began, gesturing for him to sit. "We've made progress with the cultural awareness program, but we're facing some resistance." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of resistance?" Langston hesitated, then pulled out a tablet, scrolling to a news article. The headline read, "Airlines Bias Program Under Fire. Critics Claim It's a PR Stunt." Below it, a photo of Marcus from the forum stared back at him. "Public opinion is split," Langston explained. "Some are praising the initiative, but others see it as superficial, especially with the media attention around Miss Conway." Marcus's jaw tightened. "This isn't about media attention. It's about making sure what happened doesn't happen again." "I know," Langston said, "but we need to address the perception issue." Marcus's voice was calm but edged with steel. "The perception issue will take care of itself when the results speak for themselves. What we can't do is let fear dictate our actions." Langston nodded, but the tension in the room didn't dissipate. The weight of skepticism, both internal and external, was palpable. Later that week, the first trial session of the revamped training program began. Marcus stood at the front of the room, a mix of airline employees and community representatives seated before him. Rebecca was there too, sitting near the back but taking careful notes. "This isn't just about fixing a moment," Marcus began, his voice steady. "It's about addressing the systems that create those moments. Bias isn't always malicious. Often, it's unconscious, but the harm it causes is real, and it's our responsibility to confront it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is uncomfortable work, but discomfort is the price of progress." Rebecca watched him closely, her notebook filling with thoughts. She felt the weight of his words. But more than that, she felt their urgency. For the first time, she saw the scope of what they were trying to do, not just fix a problem, but change a culture. As the session continued, the tension in the room began to rise. A security officer raised his hand, his expression skeptical. "What happens when passengers accuse us of bias just because we're enforcing the rules? Where's the line between doing our jobs and being called out for it?" The room murmured in agreement, the question touching a raw nerve. Marcus met the officer's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "That's a fair question," he said, "and the answer isn't simple. It's about consistency and accountability. If your actions are rooted in respect and fairness, you'll have nothing to fear. But if they're guided by assumptions, that's where problems arise. Another voice chimed in, this time a young flight attendant. But how do we change assumptions we don't even realize we have? Marcus's gaze softened. By doing what we're doing now. By being willing to look in the mirror and ask ourselves hard questions. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one choice, one action, one conversation at a time. After the session, Rebecca found Marcus in the hallway. His presence as steady as ever. She hesitated, then approached him. Colonel Richardson, she began, her voice tentative. I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to be part of this. Marcus turned to her, his expression unreadable. You're not here because of me, Miss Conway. You're here because you chose to be. Rebecca nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. Still, I know I have a lot to learn. But I want to keep trying. Marcus's gaze softened, and for the first time, he offered a faint smile. Trying is where it starts. That evening, Marcus sat in his study, reflecting on the day. The resistance they faced was real. But so was the progress. He picked up a pen and began drafting a speech for the next session. His words carrying the weight of both hope and resolve. Injustice thrives in silence, in the spaces where we choose comfort over courage. But when we speak, when we act, we create cracks in the foundation of that silence. And through those cracks, light gets in. As he wrote, he felt the weight of the fight ahead. But he also felt something stronger, the quiet determination to see it through. No matter the cost. The auditorium hummed with restless energy. A mixture of anticipation and tension rippling through the crowd. It was the culmination of weeks of painstaking effort meetings, training sessions, and uncomfortable conversations that had pushed everyone involved to their limits. Tonight, the airline was hosting a public forum, an opportunity for employees, community leaders, and the public to confront the thorny issues of bias and accountability that had come to define Marcus Richardson's crusade. Marcus stood backstage, his hands resting lightly on the podium he'd soon address. The faint murmur of the audience filtered through the curtain, but he tuned it out. His mind focused on the task ahead. This was no ordinary speech. It was a crossroads, a chance to cement the progress they'd made or risk losing the fragile momentum they had built. David Langston approached, his expression tight with concern. Colonel Richardson, he began, his voice low. I just wanted to say that no matter how this goes tonight, your work has already made an impact. Marcus turned to him, his gaze steady. Impact is only the beginning. Mr. Langston, what we do after tonight will define whether this was worth it. Langston nodded, visibly uneasy. The stakes were higher than either of them had anticipated. The media was in attendance. Their cameras poised to capture every word, every reaction. The public scrutiny was unrelenting. And Marcus knew that one misstep could overshadow everything they had achieved. In the front row, Rebecca Conway sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had debated whether to attend, the weight of her role in this story still pressing heavily on her chest. But here she was, her heart pounding as she prepared to step into a space she still felt unworthy of. Sophia Chen leaned over, her voice soft but firm. You did the work, Becky. Don't let the fear take over now. Rebecca nodded, but her stomach churned. The forum's theme, bridging divides, building trust, felt painfully personal. Every word spoken tonight would carry echoes of her own failures, her own reckoning. The program began with Langston's opening remarks. His tone carefully calibrated. He spoke of the airline's commitment to fostering a culture of respect and the steps they had taken to address systemic bias. His words were met with polite applause. But the energy in the room remained taut, as though everyone was waiting for the moment that truly mattered. That moment came when Marcus stepped onto the stage. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced far greater trials than the one before him. As he approached the podium, the room fell silent. He took a moment to survey the crowd: journalists, executives, employees, community activists, and everyday citizens. Each face represented a different perspective, a different piece of the puzzle he was trying to solve. Good evening, Marcus began, his voice resonant and steady. I stand here tonight not as a man without flaws, but as someone who believes that progress begins with honesty. He paused, letting the words settle. The incident at Gate 27 was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of something deeper, a culture that allows assumptions to replace understanding, fear to replace fairness, and silence to replace accountability. That culture doesn't belong to one airline, one industry, or one individual. It belongs to all of us. The room was utterly still, his words landing like stones dropped into water. Marcus continued, his tone growing firmer. But acknowledgement is not enough. Apologies are not enough. What matters is what we choose to do with the truth once we've faced it. As Marcus spoke, Rebecca felt a surge of emotion rising within her. His words cut through her defenses, forcing her to confront the lingering guilt she carried. She thought of the passengers at the gate, their quiet judgment as they watched her actions unfold. She thought of Marcus's calm but piercing words, spoken in the aftermath. Most of all, she thought of the moments when she had tried to step into the discomfort and do the work of change. When Marcus finished, the applause was thunderous, but the energy in the room remained charged. The moderator stepped forward to open the floor for questions. And almost immediately, a man in the middle row stood. His voice was sharp, his words aimed like darts. With all due respect, Colonel, how can we trust this program to actually change anything? Isn't this just another corporate PR stunt? The room bristled with tension. All eyes on Marcus. He waited a beat before answering, his voice calm but resolute. Trust isn't built overnight, he said. It's earned through consistent actions over time. This program isn't about checking a box. It's about creating a culture where respect and accountability aren't just slogans, they're lived values. And I intend to hold this organization to that standard. The man nodded slowly. His skepticism softened but not erased. Another hand shot up, a young woman, her voice trembling as she spoke. What about people who've already been hurt? People who've been humiliated, overlooked, or pushed aside because of these biases? What's being done for them? Rebecca's chest tightened. The question hit close to home, and she felt the eyes of the room shifting toward her, even though the question wasn't directed at her. Marcus answered with the same steady conviction. Those who have been hurt deserve acknowledgement, apology, and action. That's why we're here tonight, not just to talk, but to listen, to learn, and to make amends where we can. This work is for them, and it's for the future we want to create. As the forum continued, the tension in the room began to shift. The questions grew more thoughtful, the conversations more earnest. By the time the moderator closed the session, there was a palpable sense of possibility, of fragile but real belief that change was within reach. Rebecca approached Marcus after the event, her steps hesitant but purposeful. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. I just wanted to say, thank you, she began, for everything you've done, for giving people like me the chance to do better. Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. Thank yourself, Miss Conway. You're the one doing the work. That night, Marcus sat in his hotel room, reflecting on the day. The road ahead was still long, the challenges immense, but tonight had been a small, significant step toward something better. And miles away, Rebecca sat at her desk, writing in her journal. Her words were unpolished, raw, but they carried a promise. I will not let this end here. This is only the beginning. The first chill of winter crept into the air as Marcus Richardson stepped onto the podium at the airline's headquarters for a much-anticipated press event. The room was packed, journalists with notepads and cameras, airline executives, employees, and a scattering of community leaders who had lent their voices to the initiative. The energy in the room was charged, teetering between hope and skepticism. Marcus adjusted the microphone, scanning the faces before him. He knew the gravity of this moment. The pilot phase of the Cultural Awareness Program had concluded, and this event was meant to signal the airline's commitment to its next steps. But the weight of doubt lingered in the room, palpable in the tight-lipped expressions and narrowed eyes of some attendees. Good afternoon, Marcus began, his voice steady and deliberate. Today is not about celebrating success. It is about accountability. It is about understanding that the work we have started is not a conclusion, it is a foundation. The room was silent, every ear attuned to his words. The incident at Gate 27, he continued, was not an isolated event. It was a reflection of a system that has allowed bias to thrive unchecked. This program was not created to cover that up but to confront it openly, honestly, and with the resolve to do better. In the crowd, Rebecca Conway sat near the back, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Every word Marcus spoke felt like a challenge aimed directly at her. Though she knew it was meant for everyone in the room. Over the past few months, she had thrown herself into the program, attending every training session, volunteering to lead discussions, and sharing her story with hesitant colleagues. But even as she worked tirelessly to redeem herself, the specter of her mistake lingered, a quiet but persistent reminder that she still had much to prove. Sophia Chen, seated beside her, leaned over. "You okay?" Rebecca nodded, though her stomach churned. "Yeah, just nervous." Sophia offered a reassuring smile. "You're doing the work, Becky. Don't forget that." Marcus's speech continued, his tone growing more forceful as he addressed the skepticism he knew hung in the air. "Some of you may question whether this program can truly make a difference. You may wonder if it's enough. Let me tell you, it isn't. Not yet. Change takes time, and it takes all of us. It takes courage to face our biases, to admit where we've fallen short, and to commit to doing better. But if we do not start now, then when?" The applause that followed was hesitant but grew louder, a ripple of cautious support that began to fill the room. After the event, Marcus found himself surrounded by journalists eager for sound bites. Questions came rapid fire, some thoughtful, others sharp with criticism. How can you ensure this isn't just performative? Is the airline committed to measurable outcomes? Or is this another corporate PR move? What do you say to critics who believe this program distracts from operational priorities? Marcus answered each question with patience, his words calm but resolute. This program isn't a distraction, it's a necessity. Safety and respect are not mutually exclusive, they're intertwined. And to those who call this performative, I invite you to join us, to see the work being done and the lives it's impacting. Change is not a spectacle, it's a process. Meanwhile, Rebecca stood at the edge of the room, watching Marcus with a mixture of admiration and trepidation. She knew her time to speak was coming. At Langston's request, she had agreed to share her perspective as part of the event, a chance to demonstrate how the program was already fostering change. But as the moment approached, her nerves began to fray. When Langston finally called her to the stage, Rebecca's heart pounded. She walked to the podium, her hands gripping the edges to steady herself. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Rebecca Conway, and I was the flight attendant involved in the incident at Gate 27. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to continue. "That day, I made a decision that was rooted in assumptions I didn't even realize I was carrying. I thought I was following protocol, but in reality, I was letting my biases dictate my actions. And I hurt someone who deserved far better." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "Since then, I've been part of this program not just as a participant, but as someone who wants to help create change. I've learned that confronting bias isn't easy. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it forces you to look at parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But it's necessary, because the alternative is staying silent, staying complicit, and allowing the same harm to happen over and over again." She paused, her voice softening. "I know I have a long way to go, but I'm here, I'm trying. And I hope that this work will prove that people and systems can change." The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew louder. Rebecca stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding as she returned to her seat. Sophia gave her a small thumbs up. And for the first time in weeks, Rebecca allowed herself to exhale. After the event, Marcus and Rebecca found themselves in a quiet corner of the room, away from the crowd. She hesitated, then spoke. "I hope I didn't let you down," she said, her voice tentative. Marcus studied her for a moment before replying. "You didn't. It takes courage to stand in front of a room like that and own your mistakes." Rebecca nodded, her throat tightening. "Thank you, for everything, for giving me a chance." Marcus's expression softened. "Everyone deserves a chance, Rebecca. What matters is what you do with it." As the evening wore on, the weight of the day began to settle. For Marcus, the event was a step forward, but he knew it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The real test would be in the weeks and months ahead, as the program expanded and the scrutiny intensified. For Rebecca, the day marked a turning point, not an end, but a beginning. She knew she couldn't erase her past, but she could shape her future. And for the first time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. As the crowd dispersed and the room grew quiet, Marcus looked out at the empty chairs and thought of the road ahead. It was long, uncertain, and fraught with challenges, but in that moment, he felt a quiet resolve, a belief that, despite everything, the work was worth it. Because the fight for justice, for respect, for dignity, was never truly finished. It was always just beginning. The crisp morning air carried a quiet stillness. But inside the boardroom at the airline's headquarters, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Marcus Richardson sat at the head of the table, a stack of reports in front of him. To his left sat David Langston, the airline's CEO, his face drawn with the weight of recent weeks. To his right, Rebecca Conway clutched a pen, her notebook open but untouched. Around the table, other executives and employees shifted uneasily in their seats. This was the final meeting before the airline officially launched its new cultural awareness initiative. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. Outside, the media buzzed with speculation. Some called the program revolutionary, a blueprint for systemic change. Others dismissed it as a hollow gesture, doomed to fail under the weight of corporate inertia. Marcus tapped his pen against the table, breaking the silence. "Let's not waste time," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're here because we made a commitment to ourselves, to our employees, and to the people we serve. This isn't about what's easy. It's about what's necessary." Langston nodded, gesturing toward the stack of reports. "The pilot program showed promise," he said. Employee engagement increased, and feedback from participants was overwhelmingly positive. But there are still challenges: resistance from certain staff, concerns about implementation at scale. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze sweeping the room. Resistance is part of the process. Change always faces pushback, especially when it forces people to confront uncomfortable truths. The question isn't whether it's hard, it's whether we're willing to see it through. Rebecca shifted in her seat, her heart pounding. She knew this was her moment to speak. But the weight of the room pressed heavily on her. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand. "If I may," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I know what it feels like to resist this kind of change. I was one of those people, not consciously, but through my actions. It's not easy to admit when you've been part of the problem. But I've also seen what happens when you're given the tools to reflect, to grow. This program isn't just about policies or training, it's about creating a culture where people feel seen, respected, and valued." The room was silent, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Marcus nodded slightly, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Langston cleared his throat. "Rebecca's right. This program won't succeed unless we commit to fostering that kind of culture at every level." As the meeting ended, Marcus lingered in the room, his mind racing. He thought of the countless moments that had brought him here, the whispers of doubt, the overt acts of prejudice, the quiet victories. Each one was a thread in the fabric of a larger story, one that was far from finished. Rebecca approached him cautiously. "Colonel Richardson," she said, her voice soft, "do you really think we can do this? That we can change something so ingrained?" Marcus turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Change isn't about guarantees, Rebecca. It's about choices. Every step we take, no matter how small, moves us closer to the world we want to see." Later that afternoon, Marcus and Rebecca attended the program's official launch event. The venue was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Employees, community leaders, and members of the press filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and hope. Langston began the event with a brief introduction, outlining the program's goals and its significance. Then he handed the stage to Marcus, who stepped forward with his usual calm authority. "This isn't just an initiative," Marcus began, his voice resonant. "It's a declaration of intent, a commitment to confront the biases that divide us and to build bridges where walls once stood. It's about recognizing that every decision we make, every action we take, has the power to either uphold injustice or dismantle it." The room was silent, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "But let me be clear, this isn't easy work. It's uncomfortable. It's messy, and it requires us to hold ourselves accountable not just today, but every day." As Marcus stepped back, the applause was thunderous. But for him, the moment wasn't about recognition. It was about the people in the room, the ones who would carry this work forward, who would shape its impact in ways he could only imagine. Rebecca took the stage next, her heart pounding. She had rehearsed her speech countless times. But standing before the crowd, the words felt both fragile and vital. "I stand here today as someone who has made mistakes," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Mistakes that hurt people and reflected a deeper issue, a culture that allowed those mistakes to happen." She paused, her gaze sweeping the audience. "But I also stand here as someone who is committed to doing better. to learning, to listening, to being part of the change we're trying to create. Because this isn't just about the past, it's about the future. A future where respect and dignity aren't privileges, they're rights. Her words were met with applause. A wave of support that brought tears to her eyes. For the first time, she felt not just hope, but purpose. That night, Marcus stood by the window of his hotel room, looking out at the city lights. The day had been a success, but he knew it was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time, he felt a sense of possibility, a belief that change, though slow and imperfect, was within reach. Rebecca, too, felt the weight of the day as she sat at her desk, writing in her journal. Her words were simple but profound. Change begins with the courage to face yourself. And from there, it grows. And as the city settled into the quiet of night, their stories, intertwined yet distinct, continued to unfold. Each step a testament to the power of accountability, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice.